Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I'm here with a VR to Hanni from Fierce and Pretty. The hashtag is Vintage Tarot, yay or nay. And in Hanni's original video, she offered her opinions and thoughts regarding vintage decks and why she likes collecting them, what she views as vintage, and how she goes about using her vintage decks, things like that. I thought I would get on and answer the prompts that she has offered for anybody who's doing a response. I'll have her channel and video linked down below. I highly recommend it. She is super knowledgeable. She's a great reader. She has a lot of great content that is educational and fun and exciting. So check out her channel. She is a wonderful person as well. I find that she and I actually often talk about vintage decks, and so this is, I guess, the perfect VR for me. This may be a surprise, it may not, depending on what I've shown in my videos or what videos you may have seen, but I do actually really love collecting vintage decks. So this is going to be definitely a yay for me in that I do like collecting vintage decks. But without further ado, I'll get into speaking about my preferences and answering those questions. So the first question we have is, what is vintage to you? Now, I thought that Hanni's answer on this was actually very interesting. She mentioned that it really was anything was produced within the 80s and longer ago. So 80s going back. For me, and I guess this is going to date me a little bit, or maybe this is a product of my age, but I do find, for myself at least, that anything produced in the 90s and earlier I still count as vintage. So decks that were produced in the 90s to me are still vintage. So that's in short where my cutoff is basically 1999, and then when we hit 2000, I find that maybe something in my head about it having been now at least 20 years ago for it to be in the 90s gives me enough of a window or enough of a gap for me to consider it vintage. So I've brought out a few vintage decks that we're going to look at. I haven't brought out all of my vintage decks. That would require a lot of going through boxes and shelves, and it would take up a lot of space. But right here we have my Thoth vintage decks, or some of them. I do have another version that I will get into in just a second. But this is the more modern US Games, the one that's currently in production, the larger size. I don't know exactly when the green boxed version that you may be familiar with was, I don't know when this was starting to be produced, but this is the modern one. I also brought out, I believe this is the 1983 greenie, and this is the one I use the most, the one that I'm constantly featuring in my videos, the one that I find very endearing for its damaged aspects, and so I brought this out as well just for comparison. I thought it would be fun to maybe, it's not necessarily a comparison video, I'm answering these questions, but I thought that this would be interesting. And then this is, I believe this is, I think it's a first edition. I would have to go back and check. I'm really bad at knowing the exact specifics, but I know in this print run that this is the one where the Ace of Discs was printed upside down, and on the Eight of Cups we have it without a title, to the best of my knowledge. So it has this, and these are the backs, which are similar. They're all going to have different backs, and I like that, actually. I don't like how in modern renditions there's the white border. That's the one big thing for me. And I also like the coloration of the vintage versions. This vintage version actually is very washed out, as some of these very early versions of Thoth are. And so the coloring, some of them are actually very difficult to see, and the details are not very fine, but there's something to it that I find really interesting. I know Hanni has great videos comparing various versions of the Thoth deck, so I would recommend checking her videos, her video on that out. But as you can see, for example, this one's pretty blurry. There are a few cards in here in the way that the ink was applied and it's been printed that is just, you can barely see it. I know, for example, well, here's the sort of defect with this print run, which I find to be really interesting, and that's part of why I wanted this edition. So I like vintage decks partially for a historic aspect. So when I see something that seems really quirky, or when, for example, there was a print run that had some errors, I find that to be so interesting. And so this version specifically was one that I I wanted. And I'll try to find that Eight of Cups, so that way you can see the error there. Because I find that that is just so fun. And this is not in perfect condition either. There are a few cards with defects that have to do with wear in terms of little creases and bends, which was a little bit disappointing considering it wasn't listed and to have those sorts of conditions or those defects. But, you know, it's a vintage deck, so you kind of just have to roll with it sometimes. And I'm okay with that. They're not perfect. And that's the thing. If you are getting vintage decks, I think you have to be okay with the fact that the deck is going to have flaws. It may have a bend or a crease. Hopefully, the seller is letting you know that that is the case before you purchase, but sometimes you just don't know, and you have to roll with what you get. I'm trying to find this card, and I'm failing miserably. It's obviously going to be like the last card I pick out. That's usually the case in videos where I want to show a card, and it's always the last one I can find. Anyway, I don't think it's going to show itself so easily, but I really like this version of the Thoth, and I don't use this one as much just because I find that I'm using the greenie that and this thing does not fit in the box very easily. But it's interesting that this edition has a sliding box, and so that's something I find to be particularly fun. But that's that. Now getting into these questions more. Why do you like or dislike vintage decks? I love vintage decks. There's really nothing I dislike about them other than, of course, sometimes the wear that they may have, but even that is, to me, endearing and indicative of love and experience and people having used this deck and it having a history and a story. So actually, I guess I'm of both sides of that spectrum in that the part I dislike is sometimes the defects and the blemishes on the decks, but the part that I also love are the defects and blemishes. So I love that there's a story, that there's a history. I like that there are, for example, with decks like the Thoth, there are so many versions and renditions and print runnings. So you can look for different coloration, you can look for different details, and I think it gives you this sort of holistic sense of a system or a set of artwork. I also like vintage cardstock. I find that it tends to be of higher quality in the way that they're printed. In modern times, yes, I like US Games cardstock among, as far as mass market cardstock goes, it's very good, but for the most part, modern decks to me and their cardstock, they don't appeal so much. I actually don't like rose petal finish cards at all. I mean, some matte cardstocks are alright, but I'm not really a sucker for a matte cardstock either, or really thick, super, super thick cardstock. To me, a lot of these vintage decks feel super high quality. I find that this sort of semi-gloss that's not so waxy, that's just the right thickness, is the kind of cardstock that a lot of vintage decks have, and I really enjoy them for that. I also find that sometimes the defects and not just the defects as far as people having used it, that's where we get the history and the story and the charm, but there's the way that they were printed, and I find that, for example, sometimes some things are blurry, sometimes the coloration is different, they don't all look exactly the same, and I enjoy that as well. So whether it be history, I like feeling like I'm back in time, I like feeling like I've gotten a piece of something that's older that is closer to the root of what it was. So for example, I love Thoth, I love the system, and however close I can get to the core, to the impetus and the crux of what Thoth is, which to me is getting a vintage deck that's so old, makes me feel closer to the system, and I feel like I just have a more encompassing experience. So there's a lot of reasons why I like vintage decks, and part of it, of course, is aesthetics and just liking the idea of owning it rather than owning it. But there's a question coming up, so I'll save what I was about to say. Do you buy vintage or used decks? The very brief and short answer to that is yes. I do buy vintage and used decks. Used decks don't bother me at all either. That's something that doesn't faze me too much. I guess we'll bring out another vintage deck or more vintage decks to be seen This is the Masonic Tarot, and I absolutely love this deck. It was printed in, I believe, 1987. It's not in print now. I don't think there were any more print runnings of it. I haven't heard any sort of word that it was being reprinted in any sort of way, but it's one of my favorites. It was made in France, so all of the titles are both French and English. It's a pip deck. I think I said the Masonic Tarot, or its French name is, let's see, Le Tarot Symbolique Mécanique, something like that. I can't do a French accent very well, but I love this deck. It's one of my favorites. I've mentioned it a handful of times. It's absolutely stunning. And yes, I do buy vintage and used decks. Even decks that are modern and circulating now and still in print, I will sometimes buy used copies, especially if they are significantly more well priced, if they're offered to me, if I come across them on eBay for a really great steal. And I tend to be a little bit more discerning with modern decks about the wear and tear. So I understand, of course, with vintage decks and older decks that there may be some wear and tear because they're quite old and they've been around for some time, but I'm less inclined to buy a used deck that is still in circulation, like where there's versions in circulation, if there is a lot of wear and tear. Then at that point I'm like, well, I could still go out and buy the exact same copy, so I'm not going to really accept a super worn version. So I do think I'm more discerning with used decks that are not vintage. So that's one thing. This is the New Age Tarot, or, well, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this. This one was printed in, what year? Does it say on the fronts? 1982. This one's such a funny little deck. It's Rider-Waite-Smith, but also not, especially in the pips and quartz, and the book that comes with it is so strange and practical and oddly specific. And there's honestly a few things in there that I know it's translated, so there's that aspect as well, that almost seem not problematic, but just odd. It's definitely not what we would see in today's day and age. It's a cute little small deck. The faces are strange. The meanings are definitely different, and the imagery is different from the Rider-Waite-Smith. There's something pippish about it, but at the same time not. It feels like a carnivore or like an acid trip or something like that. And so when I saw this one, I knew I wanted it, and I really enjoy using it. It's so colorful and vibrant, and it has so much personality. So this is a vintage deck I love as well. I thought I would just showcase that one. And to get a taste of what that guidebook I just mentioned is like, it has the nice yellowed paper because it's super worn, but let's see, let's pick. Okay, we'll do the Five of Swords over here. And for the Five of Swords, parents hand down their knowledge and talents to their children. Together they form an instinct of consciousness and unconscious action. Don't underestimate yourself. New possibilities are opened up. Seek advice from ancestors. Depend on reason. Obtain security in matters of inheritance. Like, what does that have to do with any sort of traditional meaning? There are some that will speak to agriculture, and this be like it divining some sort of benefit to crops. It's very, very strange, and I love it. So that's the New Age Tarot, or at least that's the English translation is the New Age, and that's its original name. And then the Masonic Tarot, two vintage decks I really enjoy and love. Let me put these back and get them out of our way. Do I cleanse old decks? So the answer to that is not a straightforward yes or no. There are times when I cleanse decks, and there are times when I don't cleanse vintage decks. I think it just depends on what I'm feeling like. So for example, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think I cleansed either of these. I may have cleansed this one. It's really just a feeling. If it feels almost like it has this, I know that may sound a bit woo-woo and you touch it and you feel energy, but sometimes it just feels like it needs a cleansing and sometimes it doesn't. I know I didn't cleanse this one. This one just didn't really feel like it needed a cleansing of any sort or to be rid of any sort of attached energy. This one I believe I did cleanse, and it was partially because I got it in an antique shop or a vintage store, thrift store, and it was because it was surrounded with so many items and I could tell it had been touched and looked at a lot, and so it just felt like it needed to be cleansed. I actually am very sensitive to burning incense and herb bundles, so I do that very sparingly actually, but I do sometimes cleanse my decks. This is the Witch's Tarot by Ellen Cannon Reed and Martin Cannon, and I think there were print runnings through the 80s and 90s of this deck. It's no longer in print to the best of my knowledge. I think that this version is the 19 the 1989 version, and found it in a thrift shop. Sometimes those are the best finds. I have one by me that has, it's just this almost gigantic warehouse, and there are various decks in cases or out on tables sometimes, and so I'll go through and try to skim around and see if there are any decks hidden in the store. And this was a find. I got it for, I think, $15. It's a really pretty deck. It's kind of strange and odd, and it has sort of this masculine feel to it for me. I don't know why that is. The meanings are actually very odd, and although it's in some ways Rider-Waite-Smith, there also seems to be a lot of deviation from the imagery or traditional imagery of Rider-Waite-Smith in a lot of cards, and I kind of like that. It's very strange. It's very much like of its time. It feels very late 90s, or late 80s, early 90s in the way the art style is done and the faces, and so I really enjoy it. I would say I don't use this one a ton, but there are times. I tend to pull it out on dark nights for one reason or another, but I do enjoy it, and it was a great little find in a shop. Most of my vintage decks I get online, but there are the rare times when I can find one in person. I don't live in an area where there are a ton of vintage shops or a ton of shops that sell decks, and so a lot of the time I do end up on eBay or Etsy looking for vintage decks. Next, do you use vintage decks or just collect them? I do use all of my vintage decks. I don't like to collect decks just to sit there. I have no problem with identifying or being identified as a collector, because I do collect decks, but if I'm not using a deck, I don't see a reason to have it. I don't like to just stare at it. It feels almost useless or purposeless for me if that's the case, and so yeah, I don't do that. That's not to say I frown upon those who do collect decks and like to keep them in pristine condition and not touch them. To each their own, but for me, I'm a reader and I like to read with my decks and make use of their capabilities, I guess. So this is the Rock Art Tarot by Jerry Rowland. This was printed in 1996, so this would be an example of one of those decks that's in the 90s that I still consider vintage, that maybe not everybody would. It's no longer in print, and it does have a separate guidebook, which I also did track down on eBay. It's such an interesting deck. I find that there are a lot of decks in current times that actually seem to utilize imagery and art style that is similar to this. For example, the tarot, it feels very much like the Tarot of the Crone or the Shining Tribe Tarot. So I wonder if maybe this was one of the first that kind of got that very rudimentary, almost primitive cave art looking style to it. I'm wondering if this was one of the first of its kind. I know that before the Shining Tribe there was it the Shining Woman? I forget what the original was. I don't know. And I know that one's a little bit older as well, so maybe that predated this deck. But it's funny that how art styles will come back around, or how now this is a kind of art style that I think is more in demand, it seems. And so I thought this was interesting. It does deviate quite heavily from the Rider-Waite-Smith. The keywords are a bit different than what I would normally see or actually assign myself to a lot of the cards, but it's kind of interesting to see the artist's take and rendition, and that's part of why sometimes vintage decks are interesting, because you get a sense of how others were interpreting the cards in a time before our own. You get to know where maybe this was maybe the keywords were popularly held opinions on the cards at this time because there was a different set of literature. Maybe there was less understanding or more, or the cultural influences at the time might have been a bit different. The way pop culture maybe sometimes influences the way tarot is read. All of that's very interesting, and so I like to see where, for example, this one, which was printed very much at this time and then went out of print, it's like a little time capsule of what tarot was like in the 90s. At least it feels like for me, or a facet of what it was like in the 90s. What do we bring out next? We'll do a comparison. I think these are... No, we have one more after this. So the next question is, do you have any favorite vintage decks? And my answer to that would be Yes, I would say that I think my two favorites would be one, the Masonic Tarot is one of my favorites. I know this one is harder to obtain, and so I did have to keep my eye out for it for quite some time to find one for a reasonable price. It's not a vintage deck that's often up for grabs, and when it is, it tends to be more expensive. And so I knew I wanted this deck, and I had wanted it for quite some time before finding one, so this is definitely a favorite, and I use it all the time. Another, I guess this would be a tie in a way, but all of my Thoth vintage decks are my favorite. I love this one because it is worn and loved and very endearing in that way. I love this version of the Thoth because it is probably it is well it's the earliest version that I own personally, and so this one was the hardest to obtain actually. As the farther back you go, the harder it is to find these editions, and so I cherish this one for that reason. There's also the first vintage Thoth deck I own, which is this one's from 1983. I believe the first one that I got was from 1979, so it's the greenie that came before the 1983 greenie, and it has multiple languages printed on it. And my first one I actually got brand new, so it was wrapped in the plastic and everything, and that was my first vintage Thoth deck, and so that one will always hold a place in my heart as well. So, long story short, all of my Thoth decks are my favorite vintage decks, along with this Masonic Tarot. So these are various versions of Tarot of the Spirit, and this is where I guess there's, for example, it is an example of the fact that sometimes the modern version of a deck is a little bit more high quality, or at least I tend to favor the modern version of the Tarot of the Spirit, and I think many do. This is, I think, a widely held opinion that I've seen mentioned many a time on the internet. So I did go out of my way to find a vintage copy, or depending on your opinions on vintage tarot decks, this was made in the 90s, I believe. I forget what year. It was 1992, so for some this won't be vintage, but it is the first edition, I believe, of the Tarot of the Spirit, and the font is different. The cardstock, while the same size, the backs are the same art. The cardstock on the vintage version is thinner, and there's less contrast, and there's less contrast in the images, so the colors are not quite as vibrant and the lines are not quite as sharp. So the images are actually a lot nicer and more appealing on the new version, although I will say this waxy thick US Games cardstock that is the modern way, I don't tend to like as much. So I actually do like the slightly thinner and more smooth semi-gloss cardstock of the vintage or older version of the Tarot of the Spirit. So if I could get this cardstock with this contrast and image quality, I would be all set. But I do tend to use the modern version and the one that's in current print more often than the vintage one, and so that's a funny example. I love this deck, but I just thought showing them side by side and mentioning that vintage is not everything, and sometimes, especially if it's a deck that's still in print in some way, that the modern version actually may be better, or that you may like it better. So I think there's this sort of I don't know if it's an opinion or just this illusion that vintage is better or vintage is higher quality or that vintage is more highly sought after and just better in that regard, by virtue of being harder to obtain. But I don't always find that vintage is better, and there are times when I do like modern renditions of decks a lot better than older versions or editions or vintage copies. So that's that. And then our last question, do you have a dream vintage deck? I don't have any right now that I'm like, that is the deck and I need that, and I'm currently really on the hunt for it. I'm trying to think. There are a few on my list. I wouldn't call them dream decks. I guess if there were just one, it would be basically whatever the first, I forget, I'm not as familiar with the vintage Thoth decks as Hanni is from Fierce and Pretty, but I guess it would just be the very first print running of a Thoth deck, and I would want it to be in amazing condition. I'd want it to be in almost perfect condition. So I'm sure if that exists, that it is thousands of dollars, but that would be my dream vintage deck, and I'm always on the lookout for other versions of vintage Thoth decks that I don't currently have. And so all of those, I guess, would be dream decks. Any vintage versions of the Thoth that I don't currently own would be dream decks or dream vintage decks for me. And so that takes us through the questions, and then I'll just show the final vintage deck that I brought out, or to some it may not be vintage as it is a 90s deck, but like I said in the beginning, to me the cutoff point is the 90s. I think that 90s decks to me are vintage. The Tarot of the Angels, I have a walkthrough of this deck on my channel. I really enjoy it. Robert M. Poyce, I'm such a fan. And this was his second deck after the first edition of the Alchemical Tarot. This was the next deck he produced. It's so roughly cut that it's very papery and the sides are uneven and it sort of pills and flakes off. The cardstock it doesn't slide very well. It feels like just laminated printer paper. It's very thin and bendy, and the lamination isn't stuck on as well as it could be. It's not even a pip deck. It's more of a almost like playing cards style in a way, but it does read more like a Rider-Waite-Smith. It has a great guidebook that accompanies it. The majors and the courts are stunning, and of course in the majors you get various angels that are featured in various texts, as well as fallen angels. Of course we flip to one. So in some instances the fallen angels I think are referred to as demons at some point in various texts. So it's more of this sort of Abrahamic mystic deck, and there's this Enochian or Enochian theme underlying it, and so I love that. And I tend to read texts that are of that variety, and so for that reason I really do enjoy this deck, and it was a nice one to have found. I found it brand new, and I think one that I actually would love is the Tarot of the Saints, or I believe that's what it's called, by Robert M. Poyce, and that's one that is extremely hard to get, and maybe one day I'll find it. So I guess that would be a bit of a dream deck. Tarot of the Saints, along with its guidebook, that is one I really, really want. So that takes us through some vintage decks in my collection, as well as letting you all know my preferences and thoughts regarding vintage decks. Those questions were awesome, Hanni, so thank you so much for starting this tag and posing those questions. I really enjoyed answering them and reflecting and going through my decks as a fellow vintage deck lover. I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting, and also let me know what you all think about vintage decks. I'd be very curious to know, and what your favorites are and your preferences. Until next time, bye.